Pues empezamos. Mitzan, gracias. Ok. Ah, yo debería ir ahí.
Es un gusto dar la bienvenida a Mariana Cavalcanti de la Universidad del Estado de Río de Janeiro. Y Mariana es una colega desde hace mucho rato, desde el posgrado. Es egresada de antropología en la Universidad de Chicago y ha trabajado sobre las favelas, en particular consolidación urbana y autoconstrucción y violencia en las favelas de Brasil. Ha trabajado sobre la construcción y lo que vino después de los Juegos Olímpicos y el Juego Mundial, que es lo que un poco vamos a escuchar hoy. Y también tiene trabajo sobre teleféricos, lo que ahora viene siendo la moda aquí en la Ciudad de México. Ya hemos escuchado algunos comentarios sobre la experiencia brasileña, que despierta muchas dudas acerca de esos planes, acerca de este imaginario del futuro, pero sobre eso vamos a escuchar mañana, ¿no? En la UNAM, en Sociales, en el Seminario del Urbano, al cual obviamente están todos invitados. Y sin mucho más, le doy la palabra a Mariana. Y luego vamos a tener algunos comentarios de Vicente Moctezuma, que es un postdoctorante recién llegado del CIESAS, o del doctorado en el CIESAS, al Centro de Estudios Sociológicos aquí en México.
Entonces, muchas gracias, Nitzan. Perdón, mi español es muy malo, entonces yo tengo que hablar inglés, porque if I don't, I feel like I'm 7 years old and that I really can't express myself, so I'm very sorry. If you want to ask questions in English, I'd be in Spanish, I'd be happy to answer them. But, you know, it really is impossible at this point for me to do this in Spanish. Hopefully, I'll be here more often and I'll start learning Spanish, and I promise that next time I will make an effort to do that, a bigger effort. I'd like to thank Nitzan for organizing the talk here. I'd like to thank also Alejandra Leal, who from the UNAM, who also helped bring me here to Mexico. And I have to say that I had a presentation that was almost ready, but I don't know how much you've been following, but the past 2 months in Rio have been very difficult. And I have to be honest that since the National Museum burned down, and, you know, after that the elections came up, it's not only have things been very hard on the everyday, but we've been looking at our research material with different eyes. So when I started to put my presentation for today together, I told Nitzan, I completely picked it apart because I just felt that I had to end with what happened yesterday. Okay, so, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of you want to talk about that and that you want to ask about that. So this can be just an excuse for us to maybe have a conversation about what's happened in Brazil and in Rio over these past few years, right? Maybe even since the Olympics. But so, yeah, so the Olympics are here. They're going to be like sort of this place in the middle, right? And I'm going to be looking, you know, backwards, and I'm going to be looking forward, right? So I'm sort of thinking about what happened in Rio before the Olympics, and then there's sort of a gap, but then, you know, today we can discuss the past few years. Basically, nothing has happened since the Olympics. We can talk about that too. So what really matters here, where the action is really leading up to the Olympics, because after that, basically, it's been abandonment and ruin. So that is a picture from right before the Olympics. We can get back to that. Okay, so I'm going to read in the beginning, probably. So, Rio de Janeiro, August 24, 2016. 2 weeks before the opening of the Summer Olympics was the inauguration of Rio's Olympic Village, with the arrival of athletes from all over the world. there was general criticism of the state of the accommodations, right? So there were reports of missing lights on staircases, gas leaks, dirty rooms and hallways, and unfinished facilities that abounded in all four corners of the gated condominium comprised of 31 17-story towers, right? This was sort of unfinished, right? It's right before the Olympics. Site and blocked toilets, leaking pipes, and exposed wiring, the Australian delegation initially refused to move into the village and checked into a hotel for 2 nights. The infrastructural crisis almost gave way to a diplomatic one when Rio's mayor, Eduardo Paes, commented he would get a kangaroo to jump around in the grounds of the athletes' village if it would make the Australians feel more at home. Australia's response, we don't need kangaroos, we need plumbers. So there was this huge task force that was put together, and in about 2 weeks, the accommodations were rendered acceptable to the athletes. This was far from being an isolated event. The inauguration of the athletes' village seemed to repeat a pattern in Olympics-related works, the rushed inauguration of unfinished structures, or structures that were already in decay. I'll give you some examples. Right before the inauguration of the Olympic Village, on Saturday, July 9th, the City Hall of Rio inaugurated the Transolímpica, a bus rapid transit expressway built over the 3 previous years at the expense of hundreds of evicted families to connect 2 of the main Olympic venues. 5 days later, and despite the light traffic in its early days, when it was only open for tests and training of the BRT drivers, major cracks broke out in one of the Transolímpica's major overpasses. Just a few weeks before, the VLT, or the Veículo Leve sobre Trilhos, a slow-moving tram connecting the Port and Central City bus station to the Santos Dumont Airport downtown, had stopped short in its tracks in the first day of operations due to an electric malfunction. The incident with the VLT, illustrated by photographs of travelers on their way to the airport hauling their luggage to the beautifully located downtown airport by foot, seemed comically quaint in the aftermath of the partial collapse of an elevated bicycle path on April 21st. The accident occurred when a massive wave swept away a 50-yard slab of the Ciclovia Chimaia, a bicycle path partially inaugurated just 4 months earlier, in January. It left 2 people dead. In Portuguese, the term that designates the type of massive waves and high tide that hit the shore of Rio's beaches on that Thursday afternoon is ressaca, the same expression used for hangover. Ironically, just hours before the accident, Rio's mayor Eduardo Paes was in Athens attending the ceremonial lighting of the Olympic flame. The accident also occurred 4 days after President Rousseff's impeachment vote in the House of Representatives, and that brought to a new level the ongoing coup d'etat. As social analysts and critics of the Olympic project then noticed, the ruined Ciclovia symbolically translated the general sense of a collective hangover preceding the Olympic spectacle, just as it cast doubt over the material conditions for holding the Summer Games in the city. By the way, another piece of this bicycle path collapsed a few months ago, so you can see the quality of the construction work, right? Well, all these disasters, and this idea of the ruin associated to the Olympic city is really nothing new, right? Summer Olympics, like other mega events and massive redevelopment schemes, necessarily entail the production of ruins. But there's 2 types of ruins that are usually related to Olympic Games or other large development projects, right? The first refers to the ruins of the city before the Olympics, and they take the shape of demolitions that in turn usually entail evictions. These are the ruins of creative destruction that draw attention to the sudden erasure of recent pasts, and they lend themselves both to nostalgic and critical discourses. These ruins come before the Games, and their remains are to be erased by the Games in exchange for the promise of legacies that vary from city to city. This type of ruin, quantitatively, in comparison to other Olympic venues, the scale of Rio's removals and evictions pales next to the 1.5 million evictions on the occasion of the Beijing Olympics, or the 48,000 buildings razed in the process leading up to the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, affecting 15% of the population. But still, 77,206 people were displaced between 2009 and 2015, according to the city's official sources, and most of them faced countless human rights violations. But I'm not going to go into that, not today. There's another type of ruin produced by Olympic Games, right? Let me see. Am I missing something? Yes, these are the ruins of the favela evictions, right? These are in my field site that was right by where most of the Olympic equipments were built. So is this. These were evictions these were demolitions that were to give way to one of these major expressways. Okay, this is the other type of Olympic produced by Olympic Games, right? It's one that makes them into an established aesthetic motif. Abandoned Olympic stadiums, swimming pools, podiums, and former athletes' villages draw photographers and artists across the globe and have yielded many books and exhibits, right? These are the white elephant types of ruins. And, they relate to a certain sensibility attached to architectural ruins in general, like old shopping malls, amusement parks, industrial facilities. Have all these artists and photographers that really like to photograph the sort of decay. I really like this kind of image, right? There's something about time that's just really, it ends up, a lot of these images end up being very beautiful. Hauntingly beautiful images, right? But in these cases, ruination is a process that requires time and abandonment to unfold. In both cases, the games act like a watershed that institutes a before and after for the city hosting them. So the ruins are either produced before the Olympics or it begins after the games. Now, Rio's Olympic ruins became evident even before the Summer Games. Each and every one of the incidents I just mentioned, like the unfinished athletes' village, the cracks in the brand new expressway, the malfunction in VLT, the collapsed bicycle path, all of these events, they make Brazilian songwriter Caetano Veloso's line, "Here everything seems to be under construction and yet is already ruined." This expression he borrowed from Claude Lévi-Strauss's description of São Paulo in Tristes Tropiques. And all of this, just really brings to the surface, it brings to mind this idea, right? The still construction already ruined. And that is sort of the motif from which I'm going to read Rio's Olympic ruins here, okay? In a 1998 essay, Beatriz Jaguaribe argued that the material erosion of modernist buildings condenses the contradictions of how the objects of modernity, while positing themselves as new, inevitably bear their own demise, and yet deny their aging process. She suggests the paradoxical figure of the modernist ruin to encapsulate how the modernist building negotiated a projection of a future that has now become outmoded. Its material decay, therefore, renders legible the unraveling of the modernist national ethos that produced them in the first place. So she's basically talking about modernist architecture. Drawing on Jaguaribe's insight, I want to suggest that the very prematureness of these and other Olympic ruins render legible the predicaments of the project of Rio as an Olympic city. Their particular temporal structure bespeaks of a process of decline before reaching its own projected or imagined peak, or even before their conclusion in many cases. So instead of a future that becomes outmoded over time, the material decay and unfinishedness of Rio's Olympic structures reveals the monumental and, in the end, unachievable scales of Olympic planning in Rio de Janeiro. Okay. Now I'm going to start talking more because I'm going to bring you stuff from the field, and most of that is already there. So this is a part of a larger project of mapping the city's Olympic ruins, and hopefully I'm going to be able to create sort of a typology of these ruins, and I sort of want to put them all together and follow what happened to all these spaces and to all these infrastructures that were produced for the Olympics. So it's very easy, right? Let me see, what else have I got? Oh, yeah. it's very easy to map out the white elephants, right? The Olympic Park is one that's really evident. Most of it is crumbling to this day. Nothing, initially people, the city said that they were going to make a public park there. They evicted the favela Vila Autódromo, which was the one in the first slide, right, the cover slide of my presentation, and put nothing in its place. So basically there's this vast expanse of land on the waterfront that cost millions and millions of reais to the city of Rio de Janeiro, and no one really knows what's going to happen to this. It's been shut down for 2 years already. Here, this is another type of Olympic ruin, right? The teleféricos. The government of Rio, of the state of Rio, built 2 teleféricos. This is a teleférico in the favela complex of Valemão, and I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow, but it cost something like 75 million reais to the city, and it functioned for a period. It was inaugurated in 2011, and it shut down just 2 weeks after the Olympics. So for the past 2 years, this huge infrastructure. This is just one of the stations, okay? This is, it stretches, it has like, its path is like 3.5 kilometers long, and it stretches across 5 different hilltops that are connected to one of the train stations in the neighborhood of Bom Sucesso. There were 2,000 families had to be evicted to construct sort of the stations on top of the hills, and that involved also widening the roads in the favelas, and a lot of those ruins are still there because, of course, that process was never really concluded. So that is the teleférico in Alemão, but we have another teleférico here in Providência, which is, oh no, I got the wrong, this is Alemão too, but okay, I don't have the slide for Providência, but the teleférico in Providência was even more short-lived. It was inaugurated in July 2014, and it functioned until December 2016. So something that cost also somewhere around 50 million reais to the city, and that included all the maintenance contracts. That also functioned briefly for 2 years. In the case of Providência, it's even worse in a sense because the whole thing was built to connect the newly developed port area that had all the new museums and new postcard of the city to the top of the hill. So as residents knew, this was basically something like for tourists to take new pictures, to create new postcards of the city. But that also didn't last very long. And to construct the station on top of the hill, they also demolished what was the only public space of the favela, which was the square where all the social events and where the children used to play. And so that is gone too. And there's, among the white elephants, I'd also like to include something that I couldn't find a picture of it because I can't go out and take a picture of it because it's this expressway that's supposed to connect the downtown Rio to the old industrial areas and to the metropolitan region. So I can never really get out of the car to take pictures of it. But this is also a corridor that was supposed to be something like 20 kilometers long, and it was supposed to be a BRT, like a bus corridor too. And since before the Olympics, so for 3 years or something, this has also been abandoned, causing traffic jams every day for the people who still use the expressway that surrounds it. But yeah, and okay, that's enough of the white elephant type ruin, okay? But one of these white elephant type of ruins is what I've been calling like the waterfront ruins, okay? So this, for instance, is a model of what the Hotel Gloria was supposed to look like. This is right next to downtown Rio, and it's this very famous hotel that used to function in the 30s and up until the 50s. It was one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. And this is what it looks like now because they began to retrofit it, But the businessman who was responsible for this and for so many of the Olympic infrastructures, what's his name, Ike Batista, he was jailed also for corruption scandals, and so a lot of his endeavors look like that right now. Yeah, the governor's also in jail. I mean, I don't even know if that's in here, but yeah. So that's so yeah. It's not that nothing has happened, but there's a lot of people going to jail. But the ruins are still there. This is what the Museu da Imagem do Som was supposed to look like. There was an international competition with architects all over the world, and this, in order to build this, they tore down this old nightclub called Help that used to be one of the hubs of prostitution on Copacabana Beach, one of the most famous areas. So this was also like one of these processes of cleaning down, trying to clean up certain areas that were considered to be run down. And so, you're going to, in a way, you were going to replace something that really relates to the memory of the city with yet another museum with very generic design, and that's not concluded either. So that's yet another type of waterfront ruin. What else do I have? Oh yeah, I could talk about. I'm sort of selecting the ones that I have good images of, right? I could also talk about the golf course that was built out in the west zone of the city. Massive golf course built by the municipality, and on an environmentally protected area, right? So it was a completely illegal construction, but that too has also been underused and is abandoned today. So this is, the type of, it starts to spell out a sort of logic, right? I want to discuss a bit of what happened in the area where I did my research, and about the Athletes' Village, right? Which is what I opened this with. This is the Athletes' Village, along with the Olympic Park, were built in this area. That's right close to what is Rio's western front, in terms of middle-class neighborhoods, right? Barra da Tijuca. This is one of the areas. This is the area where you have all the gated condominiums, and where the city started to develop from the 1970s onwards, and it has a it's a region that you have a bunch of mountain ranges dividing the west zone, this part of the west zone, and the south zone of the city. So this was sort of envisaged as something that would do away with all the defects of Rio and the south zone. So with the congestion, with the violence, with the mixture of peoples, with all the confusion on the corners and all that. So this was supposed to be a new, sanitized, better Rio, right? In so many ways, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. So I just, okay. I just want to say, I forgot, I just got into this. I just want to say that I want to talk about this area and the development of the Olympic Park as on that motif that I was talking to you about, right? This idea of the still construction and already ruin. Oh God, what did I do here? Okay, this is July 2014. This is when the Athletes' Village was supposed to be when the launch of the Athletes' Village took place in Barra da Tijuca. There were waiters, there was caviar, there was all this luxury, right? That all of it put together. The idea was that this was going to become like the new high-end part of the city, right? But the problem is that this is an area that is very far from even Barra da Tijuca. If you can see, do I have a? Yeah, this is the Olympic Park as it was under construction, right? And this is the Barra da Tijuca. So this was basically an area that was supposed to get expanded into, right? And so with the construction of the Olympic Park and with the construction of the Olympic Village, right? wait. I'm sorry, I just got lost here. Yeah, let me just, got lost. Okay, let me just move on here. I want to tell you a bit about the story of this region, okay? This was it's, in the beginning it was the Sertão Carioca, right? It was this very empty part, this completely empty part of the city. The first institutions that were constructed in this area were a leper colony, a tuberculosis hospital, and the Colônia Juliano Moreira, which was a mental institution, right? So this is how far away from the center of the city this region is. It was basically built to so the urbanization of the area was basically around these institutions. So that meant that it was supposed to be kept apart from the federal, from what was then the federal districts of the city. So from the 1930s onwards, these large parcels of land and old farms got purchased by real estate incorporators, and the neighborhoods of Barra da Tijuca and Jacarepaguá got established. In 1968, just 8 years after the inauguration of Brasilia, so this is also the mental hospital, right after the inauguration of Brasilia, Lúcio Costa, who was the person who designed Brasilia, was commissioned by the state government to design this master plan to occupy the area, right? So this is where the Olympic Park ended up being built. And if you look at the map of Rio, this is really the center of the city, the geographical center of the city. So the idea was that you would build that eventually this would be the metropolitan center, which would be the new civic center of the city, to which eventually the city hall would be transferred. Of course, none of that ever happened, but there is a Centro Metropolitano here today that was built by the same contractor who built the Olympic Park and the Athletes Village, but it's a shopping mall called the Centro Metropolitano. Let me see. Okay, this is Carvalho Roschken. He owned most of the land in this entire area of Barra Olímpica, and he bought all this land in the 1970s because he had heard at the price of completely informal housing, as if it were completely informal land, but because he'd heard that because Rio was going to cease to be the federal district, so that was going to change the status of all that land, so that it would all go formal in a few years, and so he bought these huge slabs of land, and he basically steered the westward march of the urbanization of Rio de Janeiro. So this entire area of the West Zone had basically 4 owners, and he was one of them, and he owned this part of the city where all the Olympic structures ended up being built. This is the only person of all the actors and people that I'm going to mention here that were not involved in any corruption scandals up to now.
Up to now, yeah.
He's the only, up to now, exactly. But, he's 90 years old, and he is very upset that because this was really like his greatest project, so he developed all these gated condominiums, but it starts with these very small condominiums, but as the city's sprawl marches westward, what happens is that the very concept of these condominiums just starts to grow. So by the end of it, he's talking about bairros planejados, right? So bairros planeados, and the Ilha Pura was to be like the new anchor of his westward march, and it was to be sort of the apex of the Carvalho Roschken-led urbanization of the west zone of the city. no, I'm not going to talk about this. Don't have that much time. So, Dr. Carlos, right, he speaks of his trajectory like one reciting a well-rehearsed text about a self-made man of long-term vision and attitude to implement his vision, despite, the incredulity of his fellows and peers. His company was set up to execute a series of public works in the construction of Brasilia, but upon the conclusion of the new capital, Dr. Carlos brought the company to Rio and remade it into a real estate contracting firm that soon began to reshape the western region of Rio. But in this, I'm talking about, right, these vast expanses of land that get developed with some sort of planning. But in the South Zone, and like in Brasilia before that, the good living of the elite in enclosed communities and fortified compounds entails services and servants. So all of this requires infrastructure, labor, and maintenance. The consumerist utopia cannot do without low-end paying jobs that literally maintain the picture-perfect surroundings, elaborate gardens, and care for the heirs to this urban-denying utopia. So one of the effects of all of this has been the astounding expansion of the favelas in this region. So this is a table with the number of houses in the favelas in the region surrounding the Olympic Park and the Athletes Village. Okay, so let's take a look at Asa Branca, for instance, which it's one of the clearest examples of this. According to the 2000 census, there were 567 houses there. In 2010, that had doubled in 10 years. In 2012, I counted these myself. I led the team that counted these houses. There were 1,500 houses. So what I'm trying to sort of show is that it's not just about the Athletes Village and it's not just about the Olympic Park, but all of this sort of triggered this rampant urbanization and speculation in this area. This is a map. This is a map with all the real estate, the new real estate enterprises that were launched between 2010 and 2013. All of these were built to cater not to the upper classes that the Athletes Village expected, but to the middle classes that would, of course, follow the new lifestyle or the new stylish neighborhood. Okay, now we can jump sort of to, let me see if we really can. Yeah, we can. So, after that, like I said, there was the huge fiasco of the opening of the Olympic Village. And it, of course, after the Olympics, it had to be finished, right, before it could be delivered to its buyers. Except that there are 3,600 apartments in these 17-floor towers. They only put 3 buildings up for sale, and they sold less than 300 units. So this means that we have this massive ghost town with very incredible grounds and amazing swimming pools, manicured lawns, and it's supposed to have, each building is supposed to have a gym and all sorts of services, and all this infrastructure has been in place for the past 2-3 years, except that it's a ghost town. Buyers, the Carvalho Hoskin was supposed to have delivered this to its buyers 1 year ago in June 2017, but they didn't. In May 2018, they relaunched the enterprise, and this is where the unwritten begins. So I'm doing a collaborative research with my fellow anthropologist Julia O'Donnell and architect Lilian Sampaio, in which we sort of want to tell the story of this. We've been trying to get in so many ways. We haven't got any authorization, so we decided to go there and pretend that we wanted to buy an apartment. We went there initially in March, and the stand was completely deserted. And we try to go in, and we asked, we'd be interested to find out, when when are they going to relaunch this? What's going to happen? And basically, there was no one to tell us anything. They looked at us like we were crazy. But just a few months afterwards, they relaunched the whole enterprise. So we went there one afternoon, again, pretending that we wanted to buy an apartment, since we can't get clearance to do this research. So we pretended that we wanted to buy an apartment. We were received by the head of public relations of the Carvalho-Hoskin Company, who spent 3 hours with us, walking around the park in a golf course so that we could see the beautiful grounds of, the Ilha Pura, as it's called. No one called him. There were no other people there to see these buildings. And it's just... So we spent 3 hours, and they're still selling it for the same asking price that they had before. So that's 800,000 reais for a 2-bedroom apartment. That's about $200,000, which is what? No, reais. 800 mil. 800 mil. Reais. Yeah, no, it's about 200,000 reais, uns 200 mil. But that's about the price of a 2-bedroom apartment in the south zone of the city. That's not on the other side of the city, right? So this, yeah. So we found out there's this group, of course, of the people who actually bought these apartments, and they don't, right? They have this group on Facebook that's, lesados. What's the word? The legal word for the people that got affected. Damaged. Yeah, affected, right? Sort of the victims of all of this. And there's we met with the leader of this. She said that she had all these calculations that were amazing. She said that if they sell 1 unit a day, it's going to take them 9 years to sell all these units. They are very much concerned with the maintenance, and because if only 300 people move in here, who is going to pay for the maintenance of these public areas? And it's supposed to be a public park, so that is also making these people even more angry. They've tried to trade these apartments for other apartments that the Carvalho-Hoskin Company has sold, but they haven't been able to do that yet. So what we find is that there is this complete ghost town, and that it's really hard for people to move in because no one wants to move into a ghost town, right? In the meantime, they won't lower the prices. I'm still hoping that the movement of the homeless will occupy this area or something. But for now, it remains. No, this isn't something else. It just remains like this, right? This complete ghost town in the middle of nowhere, because like I was saying, most of the development of this area depended on the success of what was going to happen to this and to the Olympic Park. But since nothing has happened, the entire area has turned into one of these Olympic ruins, right? Into still construction, already ruined. So if you think about that map that I showed you with all the launchings, very few of those have gone on the market. Very few of those have been sold. So what we're left with in the end is basically a city that was stretched to create this new neighborhood of Barra Olímpica that has turned into a complete ghost town. This is a picture that we got from the buyers, right? The affected buyers or the damaged buyers. And they've been denouncing that Carvalho-Hoskin has been turning on the lights at night so that it doesn't look like a ghost town, even though there's no one living there. So that's one more thing to pay for the maintenance, right? Yeah, and this is like the far end of it. This is sort of a view of what has become of this area. Okay, let me try to wrap things up with a written conclusion here. Well, in 2009, right, when the Witten bid for the Olympics was announced, the general optimism stemming from economic prosperity, years of decline in inequality rates, soaring oil revenues, boom in real estate markets, and a great deal of city marketing drew a picture of redemption from a decades-long spiral of social decline, urban decay, and rising crime rates. Infrastructural upgrading works in the favelas, this is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, like monumentally inscribed them in the cityscapes, and that was part, this incorporation of the favelas into the landscape was part of this optimism. This optimism was also considerably reinforced by the initial success of what was called the Pacifying Police Units program, which consisted in the permanent occupation of most of the favelas in the cities by recent recruits of the police, because of course you couldn't put policemen that were involved in the usual corruption schemes in the favelas. But, the manifest objective of this project was to do away with the weapons and the armed conflicts that constituted one of the key obstacles to constructing a veritable image of a city suited to host global events like the 2014 Soccer World Cup and the Summer Games. By the time the Olympics were over, the context in which the Olympic bid had been announced had dissipated, and expectations were completely reversed. Economic recession, corruption scandals, constant shootouts in the favelas in the state of Rio, and also the state of Rio's unprecedented debt and institutional breakdown that following the plummeting of oil prices on the global market engulfed the images of a city gloriously rising out of a long process of decadence, of decay. So this temporality of Rio's Olympic ruins can be extended to other programs and projects that follow the same logic of still construction already ruined, like, for instance, the pacification program. First, the Mora Carioca, which was this program whose mission was to urbanize all of the favela cities by 2020, was radically downsized, and then it got canceled. So it never really happened. After its launch in mid-2010, it had been announced as the greatest legacy of the 2016 Olympic Games. But absolutely no other infrastructural upgrading program replaced it. This is a map of the removals, of the favela removals of the period. So this is, these are the Olympic clusters. Okay, and these are the favelas that got removed from these Olympic clusters. This is the area. This is the other side of the Western Zone, which is the most impoverished area of the city, the area that has the least infrastructure and the most people. So you can see that there is a total tendency of the westward march, not over here, which is where the Olympic Park and all the Olympic venues were built, but up here, right, where the poor already were and where they still remain. And, there's new poor people that have been removed there, too. And, of course, this was part of the social housing program called Minha Casa Minha Vida that seems to suffer from the same curse as the Olympic structures in the sense that they start to crumble as soon as it rains in the beginning. So what you have is the production of new ruins also in the periphery in terms of the social housing program. But I think but to go back to talk to about the pacification program, the UPP program, it also shows unequivocal signs of its undoing, first with mounting reports of continued police violence and corruption, but also the gradual return of armed conflicts in the favelas. To favela residents, this comes as no surprise, right? Back in 2001, I did a research evaluation of the UPP program, and residents were already skeptical of its future, and they pondered quite candidly that it would only last up until the Olympics. It turns out that this was an optimistic estimate. In the wake of the UPP collapse, the state government has resorted to its long-standing strategies of enhanced militarization and violent police operations in the favelas during the Olympic Games. During the Olympic Games, this was a toll of police violence. This is an article written by journalist Catherine Osborne. During the first week of the Olympics, there were at least 59 shootings and shootouts in the greater Rio area. That's an average of 8.4 per day, almost double than the previous week. 34 people were wounded, out of which 14 died. 11 civilians and 3 security agents. An average of 4.8 people were wounded per day. We miss those days. In February, and in the face of this institutional breakdown and the breakdown of the state of Rio, the federal government declared a military intervention in the state of Rio. So now the army is responsible for policing the favelas. And what we see is a rise in the number of shootouts, in the number of massacres, in the number of dead, and in the number of wounded. This is, yeah, these are the numbers for the first 6 months. I could go into this, but, you know, we don't have time to go into the public security crisis. But in this sense, it's yet again, you know, still construction already ruined. This idea that you had a program that was supposed to permanently occupy the favelas and try to change the violence of the incursions, and what we have in its place is, once again, more tanks, more military, more guns. The Olympics were also supposed to provide the vital push to the cleaning up of Guanabara Bay and the Jacarepaguá Lagoon, which are the big bodies of water in the city, right? But as early as 2015, the city and state governments had already admitted it would take an additional 20 billion reais in 20 years to achieve the regular treatment of 80% of the sewage dumped in the bay, pledged back in the original candidacy. So the cycle of fast development in the area surrounding the Olympic Park suffers the same infrastructural deficiencies as the rest of the west zone of Rio. The Olympic City is therefore bound to dump more sewage into the already polluted and congested Guanabara Bay. This figure, right, of Rio's premature Olympic ruins, the still construction already ruined, can also be taken beyond their literal materiality, as in the case of these programs, right, in terms of security and in terms of the environment. We had these massive blueprints of transformation, and all of them get cut short. And in the end, what one is left with, all levels of government are left with, is sort of the administration of these ruins. So like the already crumbling Olympics-related infrastructures, some of the programs, policies, and initiatives that initially justified the Olympic project underwent a similar trajectory of dismantlement before the Games. Still construction already ruined. But today, August 29, 2018, I would go even further and suggest that the still construction already ruined image can be expanded to include Brazil's democracy, right? Short-lived democracy from the 1980s until the end of this year, if that long. Thank you. Sorry about the mess.
And Mexico City's airport.
And Mexico City's airport. I'm wondering what they're going to do with the old airport.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación para estar acá. Y bueno, tengo pues preparados unos comentarios, ¿no?, para Mariana.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think your research is interesting for many reasons, but one is because it allows to think from this particular case of Rio, and in this context of production of the space, linking to the Olympic Games, different dimensions and contradictions connect to the production of space within capitalism, but also different dimensions associated with our imagination or representation of historical time and our ideas of progress, modernity, and so on. That is to say, it seems to me that this singular case has a more universal resonance in different senses. Listening now and reading some
earlier
articles,
versions.
yes. With this approach to the ruins, I inevitably was thinking in Walter Benjamin and her thesis about the concept of history. Yes, I was thinking in this idea of the angel of history, who is pushed toward the future by a hurricane that comes from the paradise, and how, while this angel is dragged along by progress, he looks back to the past, horrified by the catastrophe, no? That the hurricane leaves behind accumulating ruins over ruins. This reference to Benjamin made me think then not so much from the exceptional, but with the history of the modernity and modernization and the actuality of a meta-narrative of progress. No? Well, there are a number of points that I would like to highlight and also make some questions. On the one hand, in relation to the idea of the hangover, and some feeling of deception, no, that go across the exposition, I understand that in the text it seems that part of the ruinify of space, the production of ruins, has to do only with the objective characteristics of the products of the product space, with its material deficiencies and its shortcomings, but also with the subjective aspects, that the material realization did not fulfill the promise and the projection originally proposed. There is a lag not only between the expectation, but also between the promise and what is promised. No? Thus, this deception, the hangover, appears as a moment to face reality, to live a certain state of illusion. However, I find it interesting that this promise of the future, this project of intervention and radical transformation of daily life, which is the material with which advertising is made, does not become itself a ruin. That is, the narrative of modernization, of progress, of a promised future that will come, that we are waiting for, continue to be effective. Continue to raise hopes, expectations. And another aspect linked to this imagination of the future that lets me astonish is how this promise of modernization are present as a radical transformation, no? As a definitive break point, as a great leap forward. No? Yes, but here I have some questions. The first aspect that I would like to ask you is if the disappointment was not expected from the very formulation of the project, and not as much as the result of a series of adjustments that were reducing their scope. That is to say, if everything had been projected and had been realized, a number of contradictions between the imagined and expected of the transformation and the space finally produced would have arisen. I am thinking in the contradictions that Lefebvre refers about the representation of the space and the space of representations, and this lag between them. The other question is about the extent of this discourse and meaning. How are they embodied? No? This discourse appears as public speech, as public speech, linking with the propaganda of the developers. No? But how people meant and what people meant what about these interventions projects, no? About this transformation. For example, you in one of your texts points out that the inhabitants of the favelas were skeptical about the prolongation of the program of pacification, and that they considered that it will only last until the Olympic Games. No? In that sense, they are more skeptical about the durability of modernity and the developing. From them, would not be a hangover, because there would not have been an initial drunkenness. No? In that sense, I want to ask you if you could talk more about the different positions about the people. Yes. On the other hand, thinking about the process of reunification, I found it very interesting, the different process of reunification. You show 3 processes. No? First, the ruins caused by large urban development projects like the Olympics, associated with demolitions and evictions. Second, the ruins that occur at the end of the Olympic Games with the built infrastructure, swimming pools, stadiums, that stays abandoned and unoccupied. However, you point out a tier process that in Rio would have been another process of reunification, which occurred parallel to the construction of the Olympic city. No? Thus, is a reunification that does not concern a moment of the destruction or subsequent decay, but it occurs in the production of something unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
In part, this sense of reunification has to do with the same construction and projection of expectation that you had pointed out before, with the unattainable scale of what was projected, no? the big, and with a transformation in the economic conjuncture linked to the project. No? But I want to ask you if this tier for reunification could be something linking with something more general, no? Not only associated with this specific conjuncture of Rio, but with some phase of the contemporary capitalism as a capitalism speculative, of disposition, extractive, voracious. No? Well, however, I want to talk, I want to talk about the second process of reunification, no? The ruins of the Olympic facilities that happened immediately after the end of the Games. Seems very interesting for me. It made me think about some points of David Harvey on the contradictions in capitalist speciality. So Harvey shows that the capital produces, says through creative destruction,
Sí.
a specific spatial structure according to the interest of accumulation of the moment. No? But this physical and immobile landscape that at what moments allow a previous process of accumulation, it becomes at that second moment a prison. No? That conditions and limit the subsequent accumulation, and that in many ways can end being an obstacle for new forms of accumulation. So, the reunification of this geography is largely not linked to the deterioration of use value, but rather to its obsolescence to produce new value of change. So, in this historical geography of capital, are involving new rounds of creative destruction, no? One before the other. So, I would think that the Olympic shows in a magnificent way this characteristic of the production of capitalist space. No? But note now, at that time, when accumulation focused on real estate development, entertainment, and the capture of extraordinary superfluous value, rather than constituting a landscape for the progressive accumulation of capital. That is the centrality of process of accumulation linked to rents with extraction rather than exploitation. No? Finally, I want to highlight the consolidation of this project of a fragmented city and the irrationality of capitalist production. On the one hand, it does not generate much surprise that the adjustment of the project are made in the development oriented to the favelas. No?
Right.
That the first objective that was pushed away was the development of the favelas. On the other hand, it is paradoxical the disconnection and connection, this contradictory relationship between the favelas and the new urban spaces. You point out about a functional link, an incorporation of people from the favelas to the workforce of privileged space, but at the same time, their exclusion from these spaces for life. I think here we have a four process of reunification, linked with the growth of the popular city, of the favelas, their marginality and the relegation, as something that comes through because the development and not something that expresses the lack of development. I mean, as a product of development that creates at the same time the opulent city for the privileged few,
Precisely.
and in the other hand, the popular city for the most dispossessed. And well, this is more bothering because in Rio we have the failure of Ilha Pura,
Ilha Pura, yeah.
with half of the unsold housing unoccupied, at the same time that the favelas grows impressively in inhabitants living in very poor housing conditions. No? We have a contrast very shocking. I believe that this process that you tell us do not represent so much an exception, something extravagant that happened around the Olympic Games.
Right, right.
But that at this juncture, a series of crises, contradictions, and paradoxes are more clearly expressed that are characteristic of what has been understood by progress, development, modernization, and that is linked to capitalist spatiality. My last question is about how do you understand this form of neoliberal urbanization in the context of Lula and Dilma, no, as an alternative or other pathway of development? And
Well, thank you so much. Should I answer, or do you want to go around?
Respond briefly, maybe, and then
No, I'm very grateful to Vicente, especially because I sent him things that were published around the time of the Olympics. So a lot of this came as a surprise to him, right? All this stuff that I'm telling you guys about my recent research. So I'm really grateful for your very careful comments and actually your very perceptive comments, because I think precisely I try to exactly not go too much into the Lefebvre and Harvey in this paper, but of course it's there, right? This is sort of how we're telling the story of capitalist accumulation and all of this today. So yes, I think that this idea, right, of the project. What I've been trying to do in all of this, because of course, when we begin to do something like this, right, and I've been following this very closely in different types of research. So I did research in the city's favelas. I did research on the UPP program. I did research on the old industrial area that's also getting completely redeveloped in terms of the social housing program. So there's all of this that I followed, throughout this period, but what, and I think that it would be a lot easier to talk about the distance, right, between all the projects, and that's one of the first things I did, of course, put up all the projects on a board and look at the city that emerged. But instead of trying to conceive this like in terms of a shortcoming or in terms of a lack, what I'm trying to do, which is sort of what anthropologists do, is try to look at the city that was actually built. So, yeah, so so in that sense, right, I'm interested in this failure not because of sort of what are the challenges that this is going to bring to the actual city to come, right? So when we're talking about the favelas, this is something I also forgot, because this is a horrible image that was published right before the Olympics, and that I think is this is right after a shootout in the favela of Bandeira 2, that sort of comes to show the level of conflict that was going on in Rio at the time of the Olympics. So basically, right, what I'm trying to do here is to describe the nature of the city that was actually produced by this disjuncture between the projects and between the city that was actually built. So yeah, I think that in that sense, right, this idea that you were saying, right, this disjunction between the representation of space and the spaces of representation, that is sort of at stake in all of this, and that's sort of guiding what I'm trying to look at, but I'm trying to tell it in a more ethnographic manner instead of trying to, right, we have all of this, but I'm trying to look at it from this very short-sighted perspective of, it used to be the alleys of the favelas, and now it's just of this empty ghost town right out in the middle of nowhere. But I don't know, I need a pen to write down some more stuff. Can I reply to the rest of it as we go along?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I was running out. Can I borrow?
Sure.
Wait, thank you. I can't think with my. I need a pen.
I have a question, or I don't know if nobody went. Thank you for the presentation. It's of course very interesting, disturbing in its own way. You know, a lot of the images and some of what you said reminded me. Well, some of the images sort of look like the classic sort of post-industrial spaces of, you know, the London Dockland area, the Dublin Dockland areas, which of course the context is very different. Yet the idea of this, or the desire to build this new sort of life, reminded me a little bit about that. And so one of my questions was whether something like the London Dockland Authority, which was public-private partnership things, if things like that, I guess it's like the governance of these, how did it happen? Where was in very broad terms, the public, the private, the local, the state, and how did those arrangements take place and so on? So a little bit about the
institutional.
Aspect. Yeah. The second thing, it also reminded me of sort of these classic images of ghost estates in places that suffered from the massive crisis of 2008 in Europe. You know, in Spain, in Ireland, in Portugal, in Greece, massive estates that were left completely abandoned with 3 people living in them, and something that happened here as well. So I don't know if that's something that you've, you know, if that's a space where comparison could take place, if comparison is something that's necessary. But my most sort of pressing question is, I sort of missed where the people were. So what happened to you know, what beyond the, you know, the ruins, the materiality of the ruins, you know, are those ruins, were they reappropriated somehow, informally, for other activities, for other, you know, in a very sort of, I don't know, uncertain, very everyday life forms of reappropriation of space? How are people living these ghost spaces, or these Are they being reappropriated for whatever, art or let's skateboard or I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of caricaturizing, but where if there's any hope, like even if these horrendous things are still there, are they being somehow experienced in a new light?
Yeah, yeah.
Those are the
Should I answer? Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, no, I think that sort of, this is a funny thing. I've been talking about Rio's Olympic ruins since before the Olympics, since the bicycle path collapsed.
yeah.
And it's kind of haunting to see that I was more right than I wanted to be back then, when you see that this entire area of the city that I did so much research in actually turned into one of these places, right? So out there, to talk about the people, right? Out there, there were basically no people except for in the favelas, and that was something that was there from the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
This is an entire area of the city, like these new neighborhoods, where you don't see pedestrians, where you don't see people, right? So that's always haunting in and of
Yeah.
itself, right? So even if it was successful, even if it had fulfilled all of its promises, it would still be an urban environment in a sense,
Sure.
right? But in terms of these appropriations of daily life, and then I'll get to the more institutional matters. In terms of the appropriation of daily life, I think that yet again, the best example comes in the favelas, right? When you look at the teleféricos and you see those massive stations that don't function anymore, they have really been reappropriated either by the drug trade or by the police.
Right.
So it's the territorial logics basically, right, reproduce themselves. And that is also something very interesting, right? In terms of this relationship between building and insecurity and public security in Rio, for instance. Because, for instance, when the federal government was producing all this public housing, right, as part, of this past cycle of development, one of the things that seemed to surprise them was that the drug trade or the militia, which is another problem, particularly out in the west zone of Rio, that they would take over these spaces, right? But why not? Well, the question would be, why wouldn't they if the rest of the city is completely undertaken by that? So that also goes back to Vicente, to this idea that, and this also happens in the favelas, right? It's usually over the past 20 or 30 years, there's been this consensus built in Rio that how do you deal with a public security issue? With infrastructure, with more concrete, pour concrete into the favelas, or build public housing and I don't know why people, or at least, there is this apparent surprise at the fact that, the city has its own dynamics and that people live in that way. And of course, these new spaces will be colonized by the old dynamics, right? Also, yeah, I think that in terms of the public-private partnerships and all that, the best place, and that would have been what I could have done, right, to deal with that is more clear in the redevelopment of downtown Rio, right, of the port area.
Oh, right.
So there
Okay.
you had like a clear public-private partnership, and once again the projects were completely downsized. So originally it was this beautiful utopia, right, that they were going to rebuild downtown, and that it was going to be public housing, and that there was going to be public space. And what we see in this area is that, of course, no, actually, even in downtown, the whole, it seems that the Olympic ruins are taking root because since the public investments in infrastructure did not, as expected, bring all the private investments, it has also turned into sort of a ghost town. And as of and a few months back, even because this was an area that was all the public services were supposed to be provided by the public-private, the private part of the partnership, right? And for a while, and because there was no profit, so because basically the whole redevelopment of the downtown area also failed. For a while there wasn't even any trash collection going on. So there was piles of trash that were piling up. But in the area where there are the new museums, where the tourists are, you have private security. So what you have is, once again, what was really clear in this whole process in Rio was that the state did all the investments expecting that, the private investments would come in. Of course, they didn't. And so what we find is that it goes back to the public, the task of administrating the Olympic ruins that were put into place, right? Yeah, so I mean, I could talk and talk, but because the difficult thing is that, what I'm trying to do is talk about a logic that I see that goes on in all these very different projects all across the city, but they're so more clear here in the Athletes' Village precisely because it seems that there really is nothing new here. It really is about the way cities get produced these days. But it seems that the Olympics brings everything up, so everything's a caricature, right? So it's not just any redevelopment, it's a spectacular redevelopment. Everything was so superlative. And so, of course, the disappointment and the shortcomings are huge. And I think that also that is a big part of the explanation as to why we also elected a fascist governor yesterday. So it's not just a fascist president. We also have now a fascist governor. That's why I end with this image, because I think that's the Rio of the future.
Oh my God, so depressing.
I'm really depressed. I mean, I'm sorry.
Vicente,
No, I'm just curious if you are considering to identify and examine the legal instruments mobilized to organize the construction of facilities. Because I remember, it seems to me in London, the main job was made by lawyers who worked for Olympic Committee or City Council, I am not sure. But in this case, where are the legal instruments? Because I see in the image, the law is
There's the law is. Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I hadn't thought of this, but I think maybe that's because for me it's become natural that the city develops with, mostly around the law. That actually, I'd say that, and it's not just in Rio. I'm sure that there's a lot of that in Mexico City. So it's like you have a law, and the law basically determines, all sorts of practices and illegalities around, or ways of getting around the law, ways of appropriating the law. But I'd have to think a bit more about that, because I think it has to do, on the one hand, of course, when you're looking at scenes like what happens in the favelas, it's usually the private appropriation of public power, or so something that sociologist Michel Mies calls political commodities, right? So you have all these agents of the state that appropriate their position, and basically that's how the corruption schemes get established in the city. So, I think that that's my fault, because as a carioca and as someone who studies the favelas, we don't really think about the law, right? I'd say that there's one thing, like, for instance, one of the things that I've been looking at in the past few years is how there were these floods in 2010 in the city, and that actually really helped expedite all the removal processes, right? Because it put into high priority to get access to social housing to people who lived in risk areas. So by then, the city created sort of a legal mechanism whereby it was a lot easier to remove or to evict people from the favelas, because once you call it a risk area, the whole process gets expedited. So it's that kind of practice that I've looked at. But I think you're right that maybe I should look at, the general scheme, or how do these public-private partnerships get devised? How do they produce the law also, right? Even if it's this law that's going to be appropriated or personally appropriated in a way that things usually happen in Rio.
Well, I have two questions. Well, first of all, thank you for the fascinating talk. And well, the first question is about the relation between planification and the idea of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there is an idea that around a sort of gold age of planification in which it was possible in a kind of regimes in which the government or the authoritarian regimes could in the past planify and develop some projects more easier
Mhm.
because they have a.
You don't have to ask people what they
Yeah,
think.
of course. So the question is, have you seen this how can I say, these kind of nostalgic ideas, some elements of these discourses that target to the obstacles or the problems of democratic regimes in the discourse of these failed projects. And well, the other question is curiosity. Have you reflected about the material artifacts of that visualize all these future landscapes? Because I am always fascinated by this developmental and technological artifacts
Me
that
too.
use architects and planifiers to visualize and to, of course, sell all these future and very hygienic and perfect spaces, because always in the mock-ups, in the miniature models, and
Mhm,
the
mhm.
video renders that they use today, something that I always see is that
Me
it's
too.
a perfect place,
Mhm.
and how these create effects or expectations, and also how these material artifacts participate in the creation of illusions and also disillusions when you see all this kind of failed projects.
Yeah. You know, yeah, that is one of the things that it's been on the back of my mind all these years, because for a while there, you know, when things were going well, let's say before 2013, the city hall had this website that was called Cidade Olímpica, and you had like time lapses of everything that was going. You had like real time cameras looking at all the construction work in the city, and you had these beautiful renditions of what Rio was going to be like, right? And it was very interesting during the process to look at that, you know, because it was like you had the impression that everything was in complete ruin, but there were these images, right, animating all of this, like the images of the athletes' village. That's what people were supposed to buy. And then, of course, there's an immediate disappointment. But I haven't figured out really how to do that, because I don't want to fall into it doesn't look like the model. But at the same time, I think that without the model, none of the ruination, right, none of the destruction of the city before it would have been possible. So yeah, no, I understand your question, and I'm really interested in all of that. And I'd love to actually know if there's anyone has done similar work on that, on any of these cases, be it Olympic cities or any sort of major development programs, because I'm really, really sure that that plays a key role. Of course, there's like this little anecdote that it seems that our former mayor is really into models and stuff. So the gossip behind the teleférico, for instance, like the stories that went around in the hallways of the city hall were that he was really into models, right? So if anybody wanted to get anything from him, they should just show him a model. We were hoping that he was going to win as governor, and I had this plan to show him like a big model of the State University of Rio and how it could be much better and improved, so that we could convince him of something, but that didn't happen. But anyway, it seems that so there was this idea that people that worked with the former mayor say that he was really into it, and they say that a lot of the things that and that he sort of ended up buying as projects for the city had come from models like from Colombia's Studio X, or like other architects like from Europe, even the Teleférico, right? There were all these visits of the people in Rio that went to Medellin and looked at what was going on there, and then, you know, so there's all this circulation of ideas that was also going on. So in a sense, it's really the circulation of these models that we're talking about, but I haven't really thought that out, but I think it really is a great question. And about planification and democracy, right? Well, I end up looking at this from the perspective of the favelas, because it's where I've done most of my research in the past few years. And it's really interesting to see, and this is something that I've also been thinking about very recently, now that it looks like the cycle of democracy is over, but, you know, how the transformation of the favelas and the consolidation of the favelas and all the infrastructural works that went into them in the past 20 or 30 years, despite the fact that I'm saying that favela urbanization has become sort of subordinated to the public security crisis. But when you look at the small-scale programs that were going on in the favelas, all of this started when, you know, all these left-winged architects came back from exile after the military regime in the late 70s and early 80s. A lot of these architects ended up in what was the Municipal Secretariat for Social Development. And all of this began, you know, with really small-scale projects that were done on the ground with residents, and all of this sort of began in the 80s. It upscales in the 90s into the city hall, and in the 2000s it becomes something huge with the teleféricos and all of that. But it's very interesting to see that the top down only came afterwards, because these were really, in the beginning they were from the bottom up. So this phase of favela urbanization that I've been such a critic of for the past 30 years, it seems that with this idea that it's subordinate to the public security crisis, I think that's going to be something of the past, because in the past 2 years there have been no more initiatives of infrastructural upgrading in the favelas, and on the contrary, what we see is more and more investment in the military hand of that. In terms of the rest of the city, this idea of planification and democracy, I think it's harder to see. I think that because Rio was in this crisis for so long, so it was really since I was a child, there were no big development projects. So most of the development projects were part of this cycle that had to do with these mega events. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the relations would be. I'm a lot more clear in terms of the favelas than in terms of the so-called formal city.
But there's a big difference between the projects of Favela Bairro
and Upaki. Yeah, that's tomorrow. I'm talking about that tomorrow. Yeah, there's a huge upscaling, and it's because in the past 10 years, what you have is this monumental inscription of the favelas in the landscape, right? So you have these big things. You have the teleféricos. You have an overpass designed by Oscar Niemeyer. You have architects that have made their careers of doing favela infrastructure, right? Toledo, Jauregui, Arquitrazo. You have these firms and people that have made it, huge careers out of this favela planning, which is a different kind of planning, but, it's become institutionalized as such, too.
Oh. Well, thank you for your presentation, and I won't be hearing you tomorrow because I'm on my way to Bogota,
You're gonna be looking at
places that are in ruin while they're still under construction. So I hope to read more of your stuff. So I have a comment that sort of relates to Vicente's comment, but maybe it's not addressed to you so much because I don't want you to think I'm being critical of you. It's more a comment for this seminar, since I'll be gone tomorrow. I'm not able to participate on an ongoing basis. And it seems to me that it would be really good for urban sociologists and anthropologists and geographers to try to deepen their understanding of two things: legal tools, as Vicente was saying, not law in general. Like, who cares about law in general? You don't need to go to law school. If you did go to law school, you still wouldn't know what an infrastructure contract is, because when I started studying these things, I asked my friends who were law professors, and said, oh, well, who knows about that? That's a very specialized, whatever. So which particular legal tools are used? Is it a contract? Is it an expropriation? Is it a new zoning law? Like, which particular legal tool is used for each development can be really important. And as I said, don't ask the lawyers about that. It's the social scientists who have to go and say, okay, well,
Yeah, look at the documents.
what is it? And the lawyers always say, oh, who cares about that? It's only a contract. And the contracts I was looking at were like 600 pages long. And so none of my lawyer friends wanted to look at them. And then I realized, actually, 98% of them were the same, whether it was a bridge or a hospital or a courthouse, didn't matter. So no wonder they didn't want to look at them. So then I had to think about boilerplate as a sort of way of governing. But the other thing is financial tools, because one of the things that bothers me, I guess, about my own graduate students maybe, or the graduate students I know who do urban studies, is that they read David Harvey and they think, oh, and then they understand finance. They don't.
They don't.
For the
We
same
don't.
reason that if you go to law school, you don't understand the infrastructure contract. David Harvey does not explain anything with any degree of specificity, because in the stuff that I've been looking at, in infrastructure, projects I've been looking at, it makes a huge difference whether the state is borrowing the money or whether it's privately financed. And states prefer to have private financing because then it doesn't count as their deficit, their debt for this year. But private financing has all these implications, including defining the temporality of projects. Because for the state, it's not good to have all these empty buildings. It looks bad, but from the point of view of private finance, it doesn't matter whether anybody lives in them or not, because that's not why you built them. Because you didn't build them, you financed them. So financial tools are often avoided by people in social science because people think, oh my God, numbers, dollar signs. They're not easy to discover. I spent weeks of my life figuring out how my university borrows money to build buildings. And that's just my university. And I discovered that they act as if they're a government. They don't go to the bank and borrow money. They don't take out a mortgage like I do for my house. They issue debentures, which is what governments or the Coca-Cola company does. So, and then I realized that makes a difference, how they borrow money. They never borrow money at less than $100 million chunks. Usually it's $500 million at a time. Okay, why? What difference does that make? It makes a huge difference in terms of the fights between the deans about who's going to get financing for their fancy new whatever. And if you were to look at cities or universities or states or entities, how they borrow money turns out to be really important. And very few people understand that. I only understand it for one little type of project in the province of Ontario, Canada, because it's very different in other places. But I think it would be really good to, I've been sort of inspired in this by my friend Annalise Rios, who does some anthropology of finance. And there's not a lot of anthropologists of finance, but there are some sociologists of finance who tell you what happens at the bank, which is what David Harvey doesn't have a clue about, frankly. And so less David Harvey and more sociology of finance, more people who can, and this is not a criticism at all, because I don't think you can do it all by yourself. I had to work with my friend Fleur Johns in Australia, who's a professor of international law, but who worked as a corporate lawyer doing infrastructure projects while she was getting her doctoral degree at Harvard, because it was the only way she could make the money to pay the fees. So she knows how to do infrastructure contracts. Okay, well, those people are few and far between, but they exist. And they often exist in business schools or in, somewhere that we might not think we have an affinity to, but if we don't understand the legal tools and the financial tools, because the financial tools are so different and they make a huge difference. Like the temporality of the infrastructure funds determines the life of the contract, and then it means after 40 years, nobody cares. And so if it, I mean, in Ontario, they usually don't fall apart, but the financing entity wouldn't care because they got their money after 40 years. The state cares. So the temporality of the state and the temporality of the infrastructure fund is, they're completely different. So, you know, just a plea, I guess, to everybody here to think about legal tools. And for legal tools, you know, there's a fair bit, and you have here Antonio Azuela and all his colleagues and everything. You have to understand how expropriation works. Don't talk about law in general. So that's really good. But the financial tools are important too, and there's such a dearth of urban scholars who really know financial tools. So it's sort of a plea. If you end up doing projects where you study both legal tools and financial tools, please tell me, because I really need to know, and I'm happy to share the stuff that I've you know, try to write. Out of this, I have a paper on the production of transparency in infrastructure projects, which would be very good for Mexico, because I saw this huge sign on Paseo de la Reforma, Transparencia, you know, it was all about public-private partnerships. So how transparency is performed, and it's a very particular, there's tools, it's not just discourse. How you produce transparency, how do you produce accountability, how do you produce good management or risk management? So anyway, this is sort of for everybody here, since I won't see you after tomorrow. Until the next time. Maybe next year I can come back and talk about financing tools, which I didn't bore you with on Thursday. Nobody likes to hear about it, but I think it's important.
No, I think you're absolutely right that it's important to look at both these things, right? Both the legal tools and the financial tools. What can I say, sort of in my defense? I'm basically a specialist on housing, and I was trying to do research, like ethnographic research on housing all these years. And of course, in the case of the favela evictions, we've done a lot of that. So we've been looking at these, at how disappropriation works, and there's some very interesting clues from that. But I think that in the case of cities of the South, we'd be talking more, when we're talking about, you know, this production or this performance of transparency, we're also talking about the production of opacity, because
in the global north too.
yeah, I guess so. It might be just.
There might not be money going.
No,
from
because
one pocket
it's
to
like
another
when we
the
were
same way,
doing research, for instance, on the evictions. Like, there's a law that you have access, that you have right to access information. So we sent out all sorts of requests.
Yeah.
We're still waiting. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's all the complaints about the indemnizations, there's the ways that they did all that. But we've asked for like hundreds of legal documents, and
Well,
what do
you're
we
not
get?
alone.
Nothing. And of course, that's data.
Yeah.
That tells you a lot about what's going on there too, right? But it's the kind of thing that sort of becomes an ethnography, not even of the city anymore, not even of housing anymore,
No.
but in terms of exactly like of bureaucracy and
it's
this
more an
idea of
anthropology
transparency.
the bureaucracy, which is probably not what you want to do, but maybe somebody else.
Yeah, no, but
wants to do an anthropology of
it's what we find, right, when we go there, and sometimes we do have to follow what the field shows us. And of course, I think that in the case of the research that we've been doing in the evictions in Alemão for the Teleférico, for instance, we're still waiting for some data. We're still doing a lot of stuff like that, and so this is way more of an ensayo in a way, right, that draws on these different. Also, these different sites of projects in which the city was produced, and so it's a bit more of an ensayo. But still, I think you're absolutely right that we should look at these documents, and that we should look at the financial tools, and that we should look at the production of, in this case, in the case of Olympic Rio, it really is the production of opacity, because in a way it's like the counterpart. The idea of transparency has a lot to do with this visual or this aesthetic thing of showing everything in real time, and having this these visions of what the city is supposed to look like in a few years. But yeah, but thank you very much.
I have just like a small question. It was about if there was the disappointment you talk about transcendent socially and politically in these groups of middle, or like in these groups that actually bought the dream of progress. And because you talk about the 300 people that like they bought the apartments and then they just stuck with it. But I was wondering if this disappointment was further than their immediate complaints, or did it change, or did it translate it into something further, like in these middle and upper classes? I don't know if my question was clear.
Yeah, no, I think that there's the people there, and there. I think that like what Vicente said, right? Maybe looking at the Olympics shows us a lot more about the ordinary production of cities these days than something more specific. I think in this case it's more or less the same thing, because I think that the promises of the people that bought these apartments, the disappointment of these people, their dreams of upward mobility, of dreaming of living in that image, right, which was what they bought. I think that has a lot to do with what happened in Brazil in the past few years, and that brought us to this result of the election, right? Because you had this initial reduction of inequality, and people had this sense of a future that they hadn't had before, and that was cut short with all the crisis, right? So I think that once again, this is and it's not by chance that we think that we might not be able to continue this research. And I just checked again right before coming here. This Facebook group of the people that are dissatisfied with what they bought has turned in the past month to doing Bolsonaro campaigning.
Oh no.
And my friend Julia, who's working with me on this, had got into a huge fight with our main informant on Facebook over Bolsonaro. So we might not finish this research, it might just become an anecdote, because as part of the whole thing, they got into this huge fight, and I said, why don't you become invisible? We're trying to do field work, but seems that neither of them could pretend they couldn't see it anymore. So I don't know how we're going to mend these fences anymore. But yes, I think that, all of this has this disappointment, because this isn't really like the upper classes. That was what Carvalho wished, right? So these are people who are trying to ascend socially, and buying that apartment is key part, maybe the main move of that, right? This was really what was going to change their social stand, and at least in their own eyes. And then they're stuck in this ghost town with all of this. But still, I think like what Vicente was pointing out, this really shows us a bit more about the general social mood and the disappointment in general in Brazilian society that brought us to this situation.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions just before we finish. I guess we probably should finish soon, unless if somebody else has it. But I was sort of drawn by some of the comments that Arturo made, and we've discussed it a little bit in relation to the election results. And we've discussed sort of what's the golden age of Brazilian fascism? What's the nostalgia for? Where's that that sort of past that's romanticized, and it also provides a certain ideological anchor for certain figurations of a national we and of dangerous others, internals, externals, and so on. And it doesn't seem like there is really any, or at least it's not clear. There isn't really a sort of a certain period that you can go back to. And I wonder, how's that related to all these, maybe now in retrospect we can already call them dangerous forms of utopia, that aren't anchored really in any sort of imaginary. It's very different from many other places, I'm sure not all, but many other places where there's definitely a certain, there's the whole frontier in the American romantic nationalism, and Mexico has several of these references, depending which nationalist you are. Which Mexican nationalist, and of course other countries too. And in Brazil there seems to always be, a bit maybe, like Vicente said, just the destruction that progress leaves behind. So when you look back. And also when you look sideways to the present, because these things were ruins before they were even finished and the Olympic Games began already. So it's not even like that promise, even as a promise, it was already not there. So I wonder if there's some connection, bringing it also home to a current political conjuncture, but there's a certain sense, some stigma, but we've talked a lot about the story where Mariana took me to a favela and we're on a mountain. It's armed teenagers that you can't look at, and poverty, and this guy selling like sort of kawama type beers, a garage telling me how Brazil is the most wonderful place and it's the best country in the world and they have so much water, And I'm just looking at him and thinking anthropologically, okay, what's happening here? This guy telling me is the best player, and there's this sort of sense of belief, but it's all tied to a future. It didn't tell me, it used to be good or something like that.
Yeah.
Somehow it must be related to this sense of disappointment of these people who are maybe aspirational and maybe want to get into the middle classes or even upper middle classes with apartments like this. But what about also all the people who are evicted and maybe promised better housing, better living conditions, better urban infrastructures and consolidated neighborhoods, etc. And what happened there? What sort of disappointments would one find there, and what sort of, perhaps another way to look at it, what sort of support for Bolsonaro, for example, and disenchantment with the PT might one find there, not only in the sort of upscale, these upscale white elephants.
In the lower white elephants.
Right, in the ones that...
Wow. This is part of a conversation that we've been having since yesterday after the election results. But and it's exactly not in relation to this, but you can see where I'm coming, And I've been thinking about this since last night, since the election results, and since you asked me this, right? What is this golden age of Brazil that people want to go back to? What people have been saying is that, and Bolsonaro basically admits is that he wants, to go back to Brazil 50 years ago, the military regime of the military coup. But what I've been thinking since yesterday is that maybe what's so special about this fascist wave in Brazil is that it's not going to be grounded in a golden age in the past, but in the capacity to dream the future. So Brazil has always been the country of the future, right? Always.
So it's more like a Trump kind of thing.
Oh, Trump wants to make America great again.
Well, yeah, but he's not really rooted in any, he's not like John Wayne going,
Yeah, but there is this idea, right, of the American dream or some perversion of it, because he doesn't really want something like that, or the time when America was white, or I don't know, before the Civil War or something. I don't know, but there is this idea that there was a past that got ruined in the present, even when Trump is speaking. But in Brazil, there really is no golden age. But then I think it goes back to this issue of the future, because it's like what was taken away in the past few years was precisely this capacity to imagine that Brazil is going to be the country of the future. And never was that so great as in the Lula years, right? Remember how happy I was? I was like, no, seriously, it was, there was this idea, and this is something that's always fascinated me, right? This idea of Brazil as a country of the future. When you look at, for instance, at the projects in the 1950s when they built all these huge dams, like they evicted thousands of people, and there wasn't this outcry there is today, right? So what happened between there? That was the belief in progress that made all of this possible. And then I think that there was the military regime, there's this democratic opening, and there's all of this going on. But then there's this, through all of that, since 1979, when there was the beginning of the democratic opening, this idea of Brazil as the country of the future has just been reinforced in the Lula years, right? Until the corruption scandals. Until the corruption scandals that all got pinned down on the PT, even though the PT is one of the parties that was least involved in them. But the fact that the PT is perceived as this, so I think it only makes it even worse, right? Because it was it was in the PT years that Brazil had the biggest imagination to imagine itself as a country of the future. Remember the whole BRICS thing, right? Where did that go? And after all the corruption scandals, that was what sort of got cut short. So I think that this fascism is sort of nostalgic of the future in so many ways. And I think that's one of the ideas that can be useful to look at this. And that can be useful sort of to guide future research. I think this is something that must be kept in mind. So it's, even though we need to find out, from other fascisms and other right-wing governments around the world, I think that might be what's more particular about Brazil. Let's think about it. And I think that is the most felt precisely in not the aspiring upper middle class, but the aspiring middle class, the people that, got pulled out of extreme poverty or of poverty, and that came to be known. And then there were huge debates, of course, because for a lot of the 2010s, there's this idea that there's a new middle class, but then, of course, sociologists and economists are going to say, well, how do you calculate this middle class? So maybe, it's really an artifact of interpretation more than a sociological fact in and of itself. But still, I think these are the people who had the most to gain. So these are the people that for the first time were able to imagine that their children would go to college, for instance. That all of that, and that is not something minor in the Brazilian imagination. So I think that, yet again, it's like the higher you aspire, the higher the fall, right? The bigger the fall. And then there's the other thing that we also discussed a bit yesterday, is that from the middle class, and once you're below the upper middle class in Brazil, most people live in areas where there are daily shootouts, where men with arms, men with guns that are enforcing some kind of law, that there's all of this, and violence is a language of the everyday. It's one of the things that I wrote in my dissertation. This is one of the things that I want to revisit in the light of the military intervention. Is when you live in a favela, there's going to be a next shootout on your doorstep. It's not there might be. There will be another shootout. There will be. It could be in 5 minutes. It could be in 2 weeks. It could be in a year. But there will be another shootout. And, so that structures the way you deal with the world, right? And in areas that there were UPPs, for instance, the shootouts had been suspended for a while. So you can see how when shootouts come back, how the fall is really big too. So I think somewhere, in between this daily context of violence and the losing the capacity to think of the future, think of Brazil as a country of the future, to imagine your life in a structure of progress, I think that's where we're going to find the roots of yesterday's catastrophe.
These encouraging words.
Beer?
We had some tequila.
Yeah, that's what I did yesterday when the exit polls came out. I
What can you
started
do?
Somewhere in the Colegio there's some tequila.
somewhere in the Colegio. Let's find it, treasure hunt.
Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Vicente.